Hello, everyone. Welcome this evening. The webinar will begin in approximately 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Really, you want to say, coming in first year, I'm not sure. I think she'll just take the path of least resistance, leave people where they are. And then she said that during the tour about that English teacher is,
Still have quite a few people coming in here, so I'm going to give it just an extra minute here. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Power of Adaptive Grazing with Fernando Falomir. A little bit of housekeeping, please make sure you remain on mute. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A. And when Fernando has completed his presentation, we will then have a question and answer session. So welcome to Understanding Ag and Soil Health Academy's webinar series. It's a real pleasure for us this evening to have one of Understanding Ag consultants, Fernando Falomir, presenting. Fernando ranches with his family in Chihuahua, Mexico, and it's a real pleasure for us to have Fernando on our team. Fernando has obviously expertise in ranching in arid environments, but besides that, he has real expertise in livestock handling and also in ranch economics. And one of the things we enjoy is Fernando's ability to walk on a ranch and to help that client to further their ranch down the regenerative path, no matter what their needs are. So with that, at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Fernando Falomir. Fernando?
Thank you, Gabe. And welcome all of you to the power of adaptive grazing. That's going to be tonight's topic. And really, I want to dig into what is the power of adaptive grazing. It can have different meanings for everyone. For myself, I consider the power of adaptive grazing the power to restore ecosystem function. And well, that's a very powerful tool. You know, for me, cattle, it's my primary tool for land restoration, just like a tractor is for a farmer. With cattle, you can do several things to help improve the landscape and accelerate the process. The only difference is that it doesn't burn money out of your pocket. Instead, it leaves you a calf every year. If you've done your job well enough, it will be a healthy calf. And it provides a solution that can be implemented worldwide, regardless of your environment. I'm in a very low precipitation environment. Usually we get 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. but I also had experience implemented the same principles in other areas of the world. So if it works for me, I'm pretty sure this will work for you, and I hope you find this very useful. So how are we going to change and restore ecosystem function to the use of adaptive stewardship? And it's really by focusing on the 4 ecosystem processes. So we have energy, the energy cycle. We're capturing sun rays and trying to harvest them through living plants and converting it into meat. It's something that we can harvest that energy. We're going to focus on diversity. So the presence of livestock will promote diversity if we manage correctly. Improving the mineral cycle. You know, a third of the world is pretty degraded. It's very arid, much like the picture you see down here. This extent of land degradation didn't happen overnight. It has been happening for hundreds of years here in the Americas and for thousands of years across the world. It is our physical disturbance to natural processes that has led to that land degradation. We have disturbed many of wildlife, natural migrating patterns, and we have even caused several species to extinction. So we have disrupted this 4 ecosystem processes. Finally, it's going to be water. So it's not how much water you get, but rather how much water you can actually infiltrate. In this picture, you can see it was just after a storm. You can see a few clouds out there. And you see these strips of green material. The only difference between the bare ground and where you see ground cover and vegetative growth, it's carbon. So carbon is the missing link and is what converts this 4 ecosystem processes. We are trying to harvest carbon, put it back into the soil, and carbon in return will do several things that will facilitate plant growth. It will allow you to store more water in the soil, and that helps plant life to flourish. So in the absence of carbon, which is in between the strips, you can see there's no vegetative growth. So it wasn't water deficiency, but rather how much water we were able to infiltrate. Here I put adaptive stewardship instead of adaptive grazing. I consider it adaptive stewardship because it's our approach on how we manage natural ecosystem processes that will determine your success. For a long time, we have always viewed this as a linear fashion. If you do A, you'll get B in return. Problem being is natural processes are multidimensional. We cannot think in a linear fashion when we have multiple components interacting with these complex natural processes. And we need to change the way we look at things. So I rather use the term adaptive stewardship because really it's our relation with the landscape and how we interact with the animals in it. When we mean adaptive grazing, sometimes we want to think that it's just livestock. And that's not necessarily so. I'd like to see wildlife in there too. We want all sorts of diversity. We want plant diversity, microbial diversity, but also animal diversity. And bringing wildlife back will help you in restoring your ecosystem function, as we'll see later on. Problem being is we have disrupted our environment to the point that it might not be feasible to bring some of these native species. We no longer have the land sizes that we used to have, and we have disrupted migration patterns by implying too much fence throughout the world. Going back to a purely natural system will be more complicated, and it might not even be as feasible in most places. Therefore, we use cattle or livestock as a proxy to mimic the same natural cycles. And for that, we're gonna depend on the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, which is the rule of disruption, the rule of compounding effects, and the rule of diversity. Diving into disruption, there's different kinds of disruptions. We can have animal disruption. In the animal disruption, we can have the grazing effect on plants, as well as the animal impact of those hooves on the soil surface. Here I have a picture of high stock animal density. How tightly I have my animals on the landscape allows me to better control the impact those animals have on the landscape. We often think that fences are for keeping animals in, but rather I like to think of fences to keep animals out. So I want the majority of my landmass unit to be in recovery. And you can only achieve that by having your animals grazing closely together. Now, you don't necessarily need fences. You can also employ herding and stockmanship techniques, but that will be depending on your context and your ability. Recovery. A big disturbance can also be just letting the land rest. If it's always been continuously grazing, allowing it to recover, that will allow new plant species to recover and establish. So recovery can also be a disturbance. Natural disturbances such as fire. Yeah, fire, it could be also a tool. As a manager, we ought to know every single tool available at our hands and know how to utilize these tools for the right application. Now, in regards to fire, although it can be considered natural, the amount of fire and control burning we do nowadays is not what resembles what used to happen naturally. It seems like we are burning more frequently and more severe burns in order to fix something that trying to compensate for a lack of management. So fire is a tool. I'd rather not use it because right there I'm putting all the energy that got harvested into carbon and is going back to the atmosphere. I'd rather see that carbon going back into the soil to help armor the soil, because in exchange, that will help me drive my ecosystem processes. We can also create a disturbance through mechanical means. Mechanical might be another tool that we can implement, but again, it might only work for a period of time. If we focus only on the symptoms and we want to come in to get a high and a quick return on investment, going on a mechanical means you will get that gratification at times, but at a high cost. Now, if you don't change your management practices, all that effort and all that money invested could go to waste. Because if you don't change the management, it will go back the way you started. One thing about mechanical disturbances is that it requires money from your pocket. I travel around the world only to find this sort of situations where we have machinery that only made it so far and eventually not getting the results the owners wanted, it just gets abandoned. It's high maintenance, it's high cost, and if you don't address the problem, you're going to have to keep depending on these tools to make up for management mistakes. So I'm not going to talk about mechanical means. We're going to focus only using livestock and adaptive grazing, adaptive stewardship to restore ecosystem function, because it's the only way that we can replicate this at a large scale and make a viable business. In the disturbance, I want to address this curve. This is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which says, depending on the intensity and the frequency of the disturbance, the species diversity population will increase up to a certain point. So if we don't see a disturbance, our species diversity is always going to be low. As we introduce a disturbance, we're going to get a response in natural systems. Now, this curve applies to species organisms in a whole array of environmental processes. This is not a new hypothesis. It has been around for decades. If we have too large of a disturbance or too frequent of a disturbance, species diversity will also decline. A clear example is making too many frequent control burns. You'll drive species diversity down because the only species that will be able to thrive are those that like fire or depend on fire for the seeds to germinate. Another example of this curve is grazing. If you come in on high stocking densities and you do a planned grazing, you will see an increase in species diversities. But if you leave cattle on your pasture year round, well, you're going to see the adverse effects. Species diversity will decline and you'll start overgrazing your grasses. Here we have a picture of low disturbance. So in brittle environments, low disturbance will lead to soil crusting, poor water infiltration, poor water holding capacity. If we don't have active biology and vegetative growth, well, the runoff coefficient in these landscapes is extremely high. Not to mention the temperature on the soil is going to be extremely high as well. So whatever little moisture that you get, it's simply going to evaporate. So we want to focus on the 6 principles, keeping the armor on the soil and having living roots at all times so that we can start making a change. Now, low disturbance in a non-brittle environment will lead to brush encroachment, and eventually it will turn back to its natural state, which might be more of a forest that will be in higher humidity environments. So the type of changes that we are expecting to see will vary depending on your environment. So we always have to go back and look at our context, where we are, and what sort of effects we might anticipate from our management that we're trying to implement. Not always are you going to see the same response. Here I have a lovely picture of my neighbor. On the right, obviously this is my land. You can see that we created an intermediate disturbance and allowed sufficient time for recovery. Not too long, but just enough for plant to fully recover. And we can see the amount of carbon and biomass we produce. It's as high as some of our mesquites. And in this particular pasture, this is my most productive pasture in my ranch. I have a short horse, and when I go in that pasture, if you don't know your way, you might get lost at times. The grass can grow as tall as a horse here. With my neighbor on the left, but that's always on continuous grazing. So it's too high of a disturbance and too high of a frequency. In fact, it never rests. It's always going to be overgrazed. And as a consequence, there's little ground cover. And when you have low ground cover, you're going to have low infiltration rates, and you're also going to see brush encroachment. So if you want to promote brush, what you have to do is basically just give it partial rest, and then you're going to get all the brush you want in the world. Notice the big difference between my landscape and my neighbors. We receive the same rainfall. It's not like I have a magic fence splitting the property and saying it will not rain past here. Same amount of rain, different management. What about overresting? Overresting can also be a problem. Here in this particular scenario, this is one of the many moonscapes that I challenge I've been challenged to restore. Let me tell you, you don't want to get to this all-time low of productivity. Coming back from this will be a lifetime achievement. What happened here is that we disturbed the soil. So we broke one of the 6 principles of soil health, which is do not disturb the soil. They came here with tillage 30 or 40 years ago, killed the biology, broke the ecosystem processes and ecosystem function. And as a result, life is barely hanging on in there. You can see a few pieces of brush wanting to stay alive, but getting started from this situation is going to take a long time. You might be lucky enough that you actually have some brush. Having something living on the ground is of a tremendous advantage. What you can observe in this case is soil capping. So here, that black ground that you see there, that's actually lichen. That's called cryptobiotic soil. So this ground has been left to rest for such a long time that nothing's happening. In brittle environments, we need a disturbance in order to kickstart biology. That's how grasslands evolved. They need the ungulates to break the soil crust and redistribute nutrients through the landscape. Here we have the simple difference between soil and dirt. Sounds like a famous book I've read sometime. Someone very wise said, the main difference between soil and dirt, it's biology. How come we have nothing growing on the bottom side? Erosion has basically washed off our fertile topsoil. And it's that topsoil, that first inch of soil, that makes all the difference. They received the same amount of rain, but only one of these 2 sites was able to capitalize on that moisture. And for that, we need to have living soil. We need to have living plants. We need to have living organisms. The only way we're going to fix this problem is by focusing on biology. We can try and come in and fix it by mechanical means. But trust me when I tell you, there's not enough money to cover the ground that we need. You're going to run out long before you can make a significant change. Instead, what I propose to you is to focus on biology. Let biology do the work for you. For that, we need to start thinking how these systems really work. So this side is not too far away from that previous picture. And what I did here is just bring animals. I had a rotation plan. You can see some manure, some hoof prints through the landscape. They broke the soil crust fairly well. And that kickstarted a whole new process. If you cannot tell by the picture, here we have a manure patty that landed on that bare soil. Hardly any life is happening outside of that manure patty. Now, don't expect that just because you bring cattle that you're going to get the desired effect that you're looking for. In fact, for this to happen, a lot of preparation went into place. We could not use any poisons or ivermectin or anything that will disturb the gut biome of our animals. Nothing that will be harmful for microbiology in the first place. So we had to wean our cattle progressively off of those products because they were harming the soil. Another thing that we need to plan for is ample recovery period between grazing events. So when we came back and grazed that grass, we have viable seed. If we let our grass grow older, yeah, we lose some animal performance. We need to focus on epigenetics so that we grow animals that can perform under those conditions. And once we start working all our pieces together, then we can have this desired effect. We have a well-adapted animal. We come in to graze our plants when they already have viable seed, and then we distribute that manure in a manner that is effective. So we have controlled grazing plan and we have our animals fairly together. In this situation, I was not doing ultra-intensive grazing, but I do employ stockmanship practices. And my animals, as you can see back here, well, this is an area that they like to sleep. If you tap into what your animals are wanting to do and capitalize on their behavior, well, then you have a lot of tractors working for you. And that's what we want to do. So that's just one manure patty. Over time, those will accumulate. And as you can see, I'm wicking fertility from my lower areas up onto these drier sites. So you can wick the fertility out of certain areas by focusing on your management. We can address that topic on another time, but cattle are your primary tool of restoration. There's a lot of flexibility that can go into our grazing plan, so we can capitalize in those sort of things. Eventually, the empty spaces between your plants will start to diminish, and you'll start seeing more diversity coming in. So we have our compounding effects starting to come in. You see, when we start focusing on biology and let an ecosystem function to take place, biology plays an important role. And some of these effects, depending on our management, compounding effects can be both positive or negative. In this situation, they were extremely positive. In a matter of years, we went from a bare ground to some cover, and eventually to more diversity, more plant species, and what you see up here on above ground, that's exactly what you expect to see below ground. If you have a diverse plant community, you're expected to see a diverse microbiology on the subsoil. Eventually, those plants will transition to perennials. Now, in all management decisions, as I covered on my previous webinar, we want to focus management to promote perennial grass species. Reason being is that they have a much deeper root structure. They can pump more carbon back into the soil. And as we improve that carbon relationship in the soil, we improve soil aggregation. As we improve soil aggregation, you're expected to infiltrate more water and retain it for much longer. So as compounding effects continue to improve, you'll start to see diversity. We start seeing more wildlife. The biggest indicator will be birds. If you start seeing a large presence of birds in your pastures, that will let you know that you're heading in the right direction. You see, wildlife plays a major role in improving your pastures because they bring seeds from somewhere else. So don't think of those elk that come to your ranch as a bad thing. What you should do is learn how to manage and have enough grass reserves so when they do come, you are still left with enough biomass for your cattle and to meet wildlife habitat. They're doing ecosystem services for you for free. So I suggest you capitalize on wildlife. Biological activity. So we want to see diversity in plant communities, in wildlife, in different species of grazing animals, not just cattle. Ideally, I would like to see as many as possible. Now, I understand that it's not always practical, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't. biological activity will continue to improve. In this case, we have dung beetles. Dung beetles are exceptional creatures. They might only show up once or twice a year when moisture or humidity is sufficient for them to thrive. But in a matter of hours, they're able to disintegrate manure patties and bury them into the soil. As they burrow underneath the soil, well, they are also working with the compaction layers in your soil profile. They're creating little tunnels where water and air can enter your soil. And that will drive microbiology even further. So we see this ball of compounding effects building up on each other if we allow it to happen. As we increase the organic content of our soils, and we bring wildlife and biology, well, they start bringing seeds of other species. Here we have, this is called a palo blanco. So it's a native tree species. It's a softwood. So it's not very hardy. Eventually it will die off or will break with the wind, or during times of extreme drought, you'll see severe death loss of these trees. But wildlife will continue spreading the seeds of these trees. And as long as I have more trees growing than trees dying, I will continue seeing an improvement. Now, this is not the only tree that I see on my landscape. Now I see cottonwoods, some huizaches, and other native trees that are more resilient. But this is sure a strong indicator that my soil biology is functioning and something good is happening. I only see this cessation take to the next level when the soil conditions are right. Now, the pastures where I see this, it's also the pastures that I have extremely good stocking rates. The carrying capacity of my ranch has increased as I focus on soil biology. From little trees, you get big trees. Now, this is a lovely sight. Seeing this in the desert and being able to cool down in the shade, trust me, this is an oasis. When temperatures hit 115, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll be appreciative of managing for biology to control and change your microclimate. And this is truly what restored ecosystem function looks like in my environment. So this is a problem. Now that I've seen where I can get to, there's no turning back. Now you're gonna see me at the ranch every day wanting to make this happen all throughout. And that's gonna be my mission in life, to see it through. Hopefully I'll get to see more of my ranch turning into this oasis. How long it will take? Well, we'll see. Next, I want to focus on the energy cycle. So I mentioned earlier that we want to focus on perennial grass species. Perennial grass species have the ability to harvest energy more efficiently than any other species because they don't have to waste energy in establishing new plant roots. Instead, year after year, they can build upon what they have and become more resilient. So they require much less precipitation to remain vegetative. Now there's a problem because they are perennial species. Eventually, they'll grow themselves out and they need new leaf structure to continue harvesting energy from sun rays. And that's where the role of cattle or livestock or wildlife is extremely important. If we do not have a disturbance here, everything that we advanced so far will regress. So we want to create a disturbance, give recovery, and as we see the species transitions move from annuals to perennials, we also have to change our management to maintain plant vigor in those perennials. If we do not, then we start losing our energy cycle. Last webinar, I showed this picture where we have buffalo grass on the left. All plant material got grazed or trampled sufficiently to promote regrowth, and the pasture on the right did not. Here, the leaf structure got old and it no longer can create photosynthesis. So this is a picture of an energy cycle that is broken. So we need to come here and generate a larger disturbance and give it sufficient time to recover so that we can see it the same way as on the picture on the left. Last webinar, one of you asked, is there a method that we can measure vegetative cover to estimate carrying capacity? Now, short answer is that no, there is no technology just yet, but this is the second best thing to that technology. And this is just an infrared satellite image that I was able to find online, and this is from 2002. What's important about 2002 is that that's the year where we started making big changes in our landscape. As you can see, the infrared satellite image shows anything in red represents active plant growth. So it's plant material that is actually creating photosynthesis. What you see here on the white, that is not a cloud, that's sun ray reflecting back into the satellite. Trust me, when you're riding on those areas, you get sunburned straight up from underneath. It can happen. This is how degraded my landscape is. Now, our ranch has been in the family for 150 years, and that amount of degradation probably started long before we even received that land from my great-grandfather. So it's been a multi-generational problem, and it's a system that was degraded for a very long time. We don't expect to see it recover as quickly, but you'll be surprised in the next pictures how quickly things can actually move forward. So that's in 2002. The situation at that time in place, we had about 150 wild cows. Nobody could catch them, so they were there overgrazing continuously. It was one big single pasture, like you see it. And we also had about 80 feral donkeys. Nobody was able to catch donkeys. They're mean little creatures. 2004, there's a big change there. You see a whole lot more red. Well, that's recovery. What happened between 2002 and 2004 is that my father managed to somehow take a hold of those feral donkeys and wild cows. And for the first time since forever, the landscape was able to recover. So finally it rested, and cattle was able to start rotating in a few pastures. And as a consequence, what you see in red is new plant growth. Now I want you to see here very clearly between 2002, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here you see a little strip of black. In 2004, of red, in 2004, it turns black. What happened there? And that's your perennial base cover. So what you see the previous year being in bright red, in a lack of sufficient animals, you start seeing that it's no longer creating photosynthesis. So you're losing part of your energy cycle. And it's surprising that we can capture this via satellite. Now in 2004, we were able to place water in these lower areas of the ranch, but a higher elevation, this is a mountain range, this is volcanic rock, that's why it's black. We weren't able to put water there until 2006. So from 2002 to 2004, you see little change here. Why? Because there wasn't any animal impact even prior to it. It still remained in a recovery state. So I would say that our ecosystem processes there were stagnant. We need a disturbance to see an improvement. And in this picture, this is 2008. Finally, through the introduction of water in those areas, we can see the explosion of vegetative growth, much as we see down here on the lower areas. Now, the darker red that is turning black, that's the perennial base that we're lagging behind. So this is one of the biggest challenge in managing these large landscapes is that you might not be able to adjust your carrying capacity accordingly year after year. And just like I build up all this biomass, well, keep in mind that I am in a desert and it might not rain for the next 2 years. So I do utilize that grass, but that's my grass reserve. And maybe in another webinar, I'll talk more about grazing strategies. For now, let's stay on track. So what happened? How come we saw this great improvement? And what's wrong is that we can still see a great amount of white here. And this is those areas. So the water cycle is broken. We lost our topsoil. We see erosion starting to creep in, and we see erosion in many forms. It can be either by wind or severe runoff. Now, I've been lucky enough to watch 15 years nonstop every day at my place, and I've witnessed 50-year drought intervals of 2 or 3 years, followed by 100-year storms. During one of those storms, we got all the water we didn't get in those 3 years of drought in one single week. So just imagine the amount of destruction that you can see in these landscapes if you have no ground cover and all of a sudden you get the rain of 3 years in 1 week in fully saturated soils. Obviously, the runoff coefficient is significant. Now, I don't want to sound like a doomsday guy. What I want to tell you is that there's hope. Sometimes we see weeds, we see invasive plants, we see mesquite, we see brush encroachment, and we want to think of it, how can we tackle that? Well, sometimes it's best to just take a step back and realize that nature is self-regulating. And if something is happening, must be for a reason. Now, the true reason is that we have a broken ecosystem function. And as a result, we see mesquite encroachment, but it's actually doing us a big favor. You can see the water lines coming through the mesquite, and some of these mesquite, they look more like shrubs. You don't see the big trees you envision in a savanna. And here you can see why. This is one of my electric fences, and no, I do not make electric fences for jackrabbits. This was intended for cattle, and at one point, the top wire was as high as my waist. What's happening here is that as mesquite encroachment occurred, well, so did the runoff coefficient decreased. And if we reduce the speed at which water moves through the landscape, then we're going to promote sedimentation. So the mesquites on the background and the fence each year are slowly being buried with sediment from soil that I'm losing from higher above. So we need to tackle erosion problems from both sides. We need to have vegetation to slow down the runoff higher up on their hills, and also we need to have vegetation on our lower valleys. That's that same valley, and these are the mesquite. So at first we had mesquite coming in to help slow down erosion, but then mesquite helped capture seed that was transported by the wind. So imagine all those little branches sticking through the landscape. Well, you create little eddies where seed is able to fall and remain in place. So that started islands of fertility where my native grasses begin to establish. That in conjunction with good animal management, then we can accelerate the process even further. Eventually, those mesquites or invasive species will die back. Remember, nature is self-regulating. This is a picture of one of my pastures where you see that mesquite here, despite being in the growing season, it's dying back. And now it's dying back in different scale of things. So we have biology in the soil changing, and we also have a weakened plant as the soil changes. So mesquite is not adapted to those conditions, and it will not like growing in that situation. As you start hurting back those plants, you also start seeing insects coming in and finish the job for you. Here we have a very curious insect that comes in, eats around the bark, and the whole branch dries off and then falls off. So not only is the plant dying from the root structure, but also from above, mesquites, this insect is feeding on the mesquites and its branches. That's the power of biology. So no need to subsoil, no need to buy seed, and no need to buy herbicide or insecticides. If you have active biology, nature is self-regulating, and yes, all it asks for us is to be patient. Let's go to our water cycle. So our water cycle is broken. On the picture on the left, we see a landscape that it has a very light soil structure. This is mostly a silty loam soil. So unfortunately, during large storm events, there wasn't enough ground cover to hold that soil structure, and water as a result carved into the landscape. Now we can think that we can control water by putting man-made structures, but I strongly advise you against that. You see, the natural path of water through the landscape is to carve its path and its self-healing. Now, unfortunately, the process is so slow. Just think about it. It can take hundreds of years for this to fix on its own, which is nothing in geologic time. In fact, us as humans, we're nothing but a bad coal when it comes to natural history. Nature has been solving these issues long before we were here, and trust me, it doesn't need us. It just needs us to get out of the way sometimes. So the stream will carve into the landscape, and what it want to do is to meander. As it meanders, it cuts into a bank until that bank collapses. And once we have a collapsed bank and more favorable gradient of soil, well, it's more likely for plants to establish. And that's what we need. We need plants to establish down here at that gully to slow down water flow as it meanders. You extend the length of the run, and therefore the water velocity slows down. Then you start seeing a complete different effect where your soil starts building up. This is the only way to control incised channels. Here I put a very cool picture. It's not a restoration, but I still like the picture. What I like about it is how this bank is stabilized. Notice that it's not a sheer cliff, and we can use cattle as a restoration tool. So if you have a gully that is cutting straight down your landscape, you can choose strategic locations where you can drive cattle through, and all those hoofs will push that dirt and gentle the slope. Once you start getting that slope to be gentle, then the likelihood of plants to establish increases. And that's exactly what we need. We need plants and biology to hold down the soil. Here, cattle have been utilized in this valley bottom. Cattle already went through here, and look at the amount of biomass that was left behind. Now tell me if you think if we have a high runoff and there's this amount of biomass, do you really think that we're going to create a gully? No. On contrary, each year, year after year, you'll start seeing sedimentation occurring, and you'll start silting up the valley bottom until it reaches a point that water will start spreading across the landscape. And that's when you're going to start seeing the biggest benefits of a proper water cycle. As we start improving the landscape and the water cycle and the mineral cycle and biology, well, eventually we better the environment for other species to come in. So we still promote that biology, and it creates a positive snowball effect of compounding effects that are gonna help you speed restoration. This is a beaver dam, but look at this beaver dam. The bank on the side of the streams is still pretty steep. It's still an incised cut. And telling by the amount of material and the size of the material that the beavers decided to construct its dam, well, that's a strong indicator that the ecosystem is not ready to host those beavers quite readily. The risk of failure of this dam is very likely. Why? Because we don't have a stabilized bank, and we still don't have enough trees for these beavers to secure the dam. Now, we always get discouraged when we see those beaver dams breaking, and it might occur for a couple of years until eventually they start modifying their own climate and they start growing the vegetation that they require for them to construct a proper beaver dam, which is what we have here. Look at the power of these critters in cutting down big cottonwood trees. They can put a substantial amount of biomass into these stream beds, and the size of this, the material they're cutting, well, this one is a bit more resilient. This is more likely to sustain during high flood events. This is a human beaver dam. Obviously, it did not stand the test of time. This is what 100-year flood event looks like. We do not have the ability to comprehend the scale and the power of nature. And when we start constructing structures to limit flexibility in our systems, well, the likelihood of failure is great. I have more erosion issues due to failed attempts at restoring these channels that has created the problem and made it much worse. We would have been better off if we just left them alone and focus on our grazing and vegetation to do most of the work. Here we have another creek. Here we have some animal impact, but not nearly enough. We have low stocking rates and very little recovery. So we have extended grazing periods. As a result, we see not much vegetation on the creek bottoms. We can see that there's a sheer cliff on the banks of that creek. And when we look at it in a larger perspective, yes, the stream is meandering, which is exactly what we wanted to do, but unfortunately, it's incised. So it's way below its natural floodplain. If we were to restore this watershed, the stream ought to be meandering across the entire length of the valley, not inside this incised channel. So obviously there's still a lot of work to be made, but we already see trees and heavy vegetation started to come in and help stabilize the soil. This is at my place. So I'm lucky enough that I cover about 5 miles of an epidermal stream. It's a fairly large river, but it's a seasonal river. It might not run in 2 years, but when it runs or when it rains, it pours. So it comes from a large watershed, and I'm not able to control the runoff on the watershed above me. I wish more of my neighbors would do more of the work that I do so that we can restore this stream. Now, as you can see, I have cottonwood trees establishing. Only to think that 20 years ago, we didn't have a single cottonwood tree. Now we have willows holding the stream bank. What I'm seeing now is that my stream bed, even though there's a large amount of sediment moving through, now I see that the stream bed is less deep and more wide. That means that we're changing the channel structure of our river. And that means that it's sedimenting. Here's another picture, and you can see the work of the stabilization of the stream banks. The original stream bank ought to be up here. So we still have 3 or 4 feet to go before I can say that we have properly restored this stream bank. Now I see with the establishment of these many trees, I am more than certain that we get there. Here we have willows. You can tell by the depth of those roots the true function. This is what's holding the soil together. And once we slow down water and with our banks start to stabilize, vegetation takes over and the whole process becomes more accelerated. This is a picture of what it used to look like and what the stream bed looks like now. So it no longer is barren and a deep channel cutting through it. Now it spreads and holds the water. There's a lot of controversy of whether you should graze or not graze your riparian areas. And yes, absolutely, you need to generate a disturbance every now and then. Now, because my riverbed, it's a different production zone, and I mentioned in my past webinar, I seclude my pastures depending on the production zone that they're in, so I can manage accordingly. So we need to have control access and make a grazing plan, but we do need to generate that disturbance. If we don't, what I see is that either you don't advance and you remain in this degraded system, or you might see vegetation taking over. You might see entire areas being covered by willows. And although that might be a good thing in the short run, it will become stagnant eventually. You cannot have trees or sedimentation occurring if you don't have other types of vegetation capturing that fine silt. So if you want to grow trees, well, you need to create a disturbance so that you promote vegetative growth. We need to focus on our diversity. As those trees continue to grow, the stream bed meanders, and as it meanders on the bends, you create these pools. So now I'm changing the way water is flowing, And the trees is really what allowed one to stabilize the stream bank. But the river did the carving and created these pools. For the first time, we were able to carry in a good year water that is natural source that lasted the entire year with no rain. That was amazing. I hope to see more of these natural springs starting to show up. And why does it occur? Well, I cannot help but to think that it's because of the trees. They are your true solar pump. Through capillary action, they draw water from beneath the water table and they raise it higher up to the surface. And then as you have those meanders across the riverbed, carving deeper on the bends, well, sometimes that water table gets exposed, and that's where you start developing your own springs. Obviously, those desert children don't know what water is. They're extremely happy. Here we have a fence line. So this is another seasonal creek. This one is just an arroyo, so it only comes down when it rains. But this is right here at the edge of my neighbor. You can see that I have a bank that is 3 to 4 feet tall. I already have vegetation, and in fact, I'm already helping him. By having vegetation on my side, I'm helping my neighbor stabilize his own stream bank. Now, because he already started meandering, in certain areas, it started sedimenting to the point that now it's able to flood irrigate my entire pasture. So when before it used to carve through the landscape and the whole water cycle was broken and water would just flush away, now it got to a point where it can irrigate certain areas every year. And now that I have an irrigated floodplain, well, the grass will come. Here we have, I've counted up to 20 different species of grasses growing here, when once there was nothing. Now there's years that it doesn't rain and I don't get this irrigated floodplain, but because we focus on armoring the soil, when it does rain, the conditions are ready for this to resume. So this is my irrigated prairie. It's natural. I don't pump water from my aquifers, and I'm harvesting that solar energy as best as we can. Started to seeing new weird species. I got really excited when I first saw this grass. I was so excited that I even told Shane, "Hey Shane, what is this?" And he tells me, "Oh, that's a noxious weed in Kansas. That's barnyard grass." Yeah, well, apparently nobody told the grass that he was in Chihuahua, growing in a desert. So now we're starting to get plants from weird places in this world that do not belong there, or we don't know if they used to belong there or not. This is what's so exciting about the work, is that you start seeing new species. And where did that seed come from? I don't know, but I don't care. As long as there's more diversity, I am happy. So this is another infrared satellite image of that same region. So up here, this is 2002 when we started, and you can see that the creek crossed the neighbor, came into the landscape, and most of it went right through. This is the same area in 20 years later. I took this satellite imagery last year. Now you can see the difference and the effects of changing the way water flows through a landscape. It has made a tremendous impact on our ecosystem processes. This is what restore soil function looks like. Next, we're going to touch the mineral cycle. Now, for the mineral cycle, I decided to put an irrigated pivot. Why, you might say? Well, I've never been so surprised in my life than trying to manage true mineral deficiencies. You see, in the desert, we have the unfair advantage that we have very fertile soil. All we're really lacking is moisture. So we need carbon to hold and retain more water. But in some of these irrigated meadows, irrigated prairies that are being hayed continuously or that have become dependent on chemical fertilizers, well, we reach a whole new level of problems that are a bit more challenging to solve. You may have all the nutrients you need, but they might be bound up on the soil and are not plant available. So that's why I chose an irrigated pivot. We started doing the same recipe. We came in, we did a disruption with cattle. You can see that we didn't graze all the way down. We left a fair amount of biomass, and we gave it time to recover. And it's amazing at the diversity that we got just from one single recovery, extended recovery period. There were hardly any legumes visible, and here we see a lot of legumes. Just by changing our grazing management, the seed was already there. All it needed was a chance to show up. Now I was terrified to come and graze this. I mean, this looks way more than 30% legumes. And I was brave enough to come in with cattle. I didn't sleep that night. I came with high density grazing and I trampled most of it. And you can see the amount of residue I left. Now, what's amazing after doing this, look at the grass. Look at the color of that grass. These are the manure patties of the cattle that came in. And you can still see the pale color of the grass of what it once used to be. So when the soil became dependent on chemical fertilizers, well, the soil biology was not active. It wasn't until we started doing grazing and putting manure back into the ground, and you can see the results. There's functioning mineral cycle right here. Dark green color, that means that you have a more nutritious plant, more nutrition plants and higher phytonutrients, well, higher quality of feed for your cattle, healthier animals, well, happy rancher. It's all those cascading effects that we were talking about. And of course, the birds came. By the end of the season, we had a flock of birds hovering above our cows. My guess is that they were feeding on fly larvae. So 2 birds, 1 stone. Nature will find a way to regulate itself. That's enough for the presentation. I would like to open room for a discussion and Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat. We'll be reading them one by one.
It's a great job, Fernando. Really appreciate that. All right, let's go to the Q&A. All right, so our first question is, what is your advice for those of us with near 100% cover of perennial non-native grasses, such as crested wheatgrass in the northern Great Plains or Old World bluestem in the southern Great Plains? We want diversity, and the monocultures of perennial invasive grasses are a huge hurdle for that. So, Fernando, how would you recommend they handle that?
Well, you're in a very good situation if you already have perennial grasses. I think you have a leg up there. Really, to create the disturbance that you need to promote diversity might involve several steps. It might involve changing the grazing densities. changing your recovery periods, and playing at grazing in different times of year, different pastures. So part of the adaptive grazing principles is that we have to be mixing it up. You cannot do the same over and over again. And that has to come from your part of trying to become more intentional on what is it that you're trying to achieve. It might not happen as fast as you like, and some of these grasses are difficult to manage. I mean, for example, smooth brome can smother a lot of species, the same as coastal grass. But you need to generate enough disturbance to stimulate a change in biology at times. Alan, your
Yeah,
thoughts?
absolutely. I would agree with that. It's again all about the rule of disruption, right? Yeah, and introducing timely disruptions. I'm going to ask yeah, Gabe lives in the northern Great Plains. So I'm going to ask Gabe for his input, and then Shane, I'm going to come to you because you're located in Kansas. And how would each of you handle this?
Yeah, and realize it's about context. We need to work within our context. You know, my environment is about the exact opposite of Fernando's. He's dominant in warm season species, and I'm dominant up here in cool season species. So that doesn't mean that you know, I don't have warm season species and he doesn't have cool season species. But it's that disruption and varying the season of use that allows you to get the diversity of both species and in the amount and the percentages that's proper, so to speak, for your environment.
Shane, what about Kansas?
Well, you know, absolutely disruptions are a huge component. I guess the big thing, if I'm trying to capture more diversity, is once I start to witness diversity come in, you know, allowing that diversity to get to seed production, and then bringing to, you know, a new disruption, a new grazing pattern, different time of year to help move that seed, dispense it further into the landscape. So obviously, depending on what you're trying to manage for, the species, but once I start identifying it, allow it to get to seed production and then utilizing animals to help move it.
Absolutely. So, Fernando, the next question is this. It comes from Brandon, and Brandon says, I understand that you can graze biological hotspots and move livestock to areas of poor soil quality to spread nutrients and biology through the manure and livestock impact. Can you take that concept further and possibly graze on and off woody areas to spread fungi and different types of microbes? I'm assuming there is also a difference in ruminants and monogastrics in the biology that they promote through manure. Any further input would be appreciated.
Yes, obviously moving between different hotspots, it can propose different challenges on your livestock. You need to think about adapting the rumen accordingly. Some of those changes might not be as favorable for animal performance, but if you are consistent with your movements, you can adapt the rumen for it to perform better. Now, I just showed a couple of pictures where it's a very extreme, from very productive hotspot to almost bare ground. And the best way that I come up with working in that sort of scenario, it's taking advantage of your animal herding instincts. So animals by nature will want to choose certain areas, and those will be typically areas that are more barren or on the side of a hill where they can see predators coming. And really, you can capitalize on their herding instinct and try to push them to those areas so that they bed down at night. Now, that may require more work than most people are willing, but there's always hacks. You know, you can always throw mineral blocks. You can put your salt where you put your water distribution. You can use different things to achieve those effects. So there's many ways to achieve that.
Yeah, and I've got some experience with this as well. We frequently graze woody areas, brushy areas, that type of thing, and it has been beneficial in terms of being able to move that biology out to other areas. Another thing that we've done quite successfully with a number of clients is what I call contour grazing, where we graze following a contour to be able to move biology from low spots up slope to higher spots and ridges. So the same concept works across a multiplicity of different types of scenarios, using your livestock to be able to move this biology out into areas that it hasn't been present in before. Before I go to the next question, I just want to remind everybody we have 2 upcoming webinars. One will be March the 7th, again at 7 p.m. Central Time, called Verifying Your Hard Work. And in this one, Gabe Brown and Regenified's Samantha Buckingham and Kathleen Wood Leverance are going to be talking about becoming Regenified verified, what that means, what are the protocols, how does this benefit you? And then on March the 14th, Eric Fuchs will be presenting a webinar titled Picking the Low-Hanging Fruit, Regenerative Tips to Save You Money Now. So put those on your calendar. All right, so Fernando, back to you, sir. The next question, how many acres and how many pastures are represented in your satellite images?
Currently, I started off with one pasture that was almost 20,000 acres. And nowadays we have a total of 23 pastures. So we started with a simple rotation of 2 pastures and started dividing progressively as the landscape improved. So that's how many pastures I have in that landscape. Now the sizes of my pastures vary considerably. I'm not going to make all pastures the same. In fact, I size my pastures depending on the productivity area of the area that I'm grazing. Therefore, I'm going to have pastures that might be 1,000 acres in size in very brittle and degraded areas. And I have pastures that are as small as 120 acres for the most productive areas. And this is where really adaptive should come into your minds. You cannot come in at a systematic approach trying to make everything equal when the productivity of your land is not equal, and it varies year to year, and you have different vegetation species. Kind of like tying back to the previous question of how do you manage to graze different landscapes with different biology hotspots. So you have to take all that into consideration when you are designing your pastures. Now, in terms of productivity, started from a very degraded system of 150 acres per head, maybe more in some areas. And the most productive, where we restored ecosystem function, is as low as 10 acres per head. Unfortunately, that only represents a small amount of my land size, and I have to manage each pasture differently.
So the next question comes from Tony. And I'm going to go to you first, Fernando, and then Luke, I'm going to ask you to comment on this as well. So the question is, do you recommend using chemical fertilizers to help renew overgrazed pastures?
I have not used any fertilizers in my own pastures, But as a consultant, I cannot tell you to just stop using them altogether. If we go back to that picture of the irrigated pivot, that's what you're going to expect to see when you go cold turkey on fertilizers. So that pale yellow grass versus the dark green grass of the manure patties, that's the consequence of using chemical fertilizers. You are not allowing soil biology to function properly when you become dependent on them. And therefore, the process of weaning yourself from chemical fertilizers should be progressive, or else be ready to attend to the consequences, which might be loss of production or higher inputs in the form of water or recovery periods that will take for that grass to recover.
I'll
Luke,
echo
what
and
would you
chime
add to
in with,
that?
yeah, I would echo and chime in with what Fernando had said there. Understand the consequences and of using those applied amendments. Yeah, you might see a short-term benefit, but is there more longer-term cascading negatives that might come from that? Understand the disruption that is causing. Depends on a lot of the context here financially as well. Is it how fast do you need that part to recover? As I said, it can be a short-term gain, but is it a long-term negative? So Fernando nailed it on the head. Your disruption with the biology and association there is tremendously disrupted. So just understand the consequences there. If it's something that you're curious about, obviously we would recommend doing a trial, check strip, see what the results are there, and weigh out the economics and the overall net gain of that.
Fernando, did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so this pale yellow grass, that's an area that didn't receive a manure patty. Now you can see that had very high intensive grazing here, and the manure distribution was exceptional. And this was only from one grazing event. Now, ideally, the more you replicate this, in a matter of 2 or 3 years, you'll ensure 100% ground cover. So.
Excellent. The next question is from John. And John says, how would you determine how much residue to leave behind with old world blue stem?
It all depends on your context, and you manage for what you want. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Do you want to reduce runoff? You want to create a higher buffer to regulate temperature? I mean, the more you leave behind, the better. But as a grazer, you might run into trouble, and you might not have enough stockpile to get that armor that you want. So make a close estimation of how much actual biomass you have available for grazing, and you might have to adjust your numbers to manage for what you want.
Thank you. Shane, anything to add to that?
Fernando did a good job explaining. The biggest challenge would be is trying to get enough armor laid down on that soil, keep that soil surface covered, keep the moisture in the soil to keep the biology active, so we can start building some aggregation to hopefully capture some latent seed bank germination, and or as wildlife move through the landscape or livestock move through, maybe get some new diversity in place of plant species through that action. But just keep that soil covered. That's the key.
Thank you, Shane. So the next is a comment, Fernando, from Roy. And Roy says, many generous thanks. You have stunned me with your work. So quite a compliment, Fernando. The next is from Ike. And Ike says, some of our native pastures are high in salinity and sulfur. The plants just won't yield or have high vegetation. So what would you recommend where someone has soils that are high in salinity? What could be some strategies for them to help resolve some of those issues?
That sounds like a very typical intermountain area. The water quality in those regions, it's basically has gypsum, which is calcium and sulfur. So you're gonna have that same effect. That's more than likely your root cause. Really, the best thing you can do is work on your soil aggregate structure. So sulfur and calcium can be dissolved rarely in water, but you need to have that soil aggregation to be able to, for them to go lower on the soil profile away from the root zone. Now, the only way you're going to be able to achieve that is by working on your soil armor, letting those roots to fully recuperate before grazing. So it's a tough question to answer if I don't know your exact context, but that's one way to do it. Another way is introducing, not introducing, but allow for biodiversity to also improve. As you improve biodiversity, you might be able to buffer some of that salinity issues as you increase carbon in the soil.
Yeah, we've dealt with issues like this with a number of clients, particularly in the Intermountain West. So totally agree with you, Fernando, in that regard. We do see this a lot in various areas out there. And another one of the keys here, and it goes hand in hand with what Fernando said, is implementing grazing strategies that are going to allow you to build more mycorrhizal population. We have found that as we're able to build greater mycorrhizal colonization, that certainly begins to help alleviate these issues and make these areas far more productive. Anything else from any of our other panelists on this regard?
Yeah, Shane, would you come on and talk a little bit about changing the fungal component within the rumen in order to stimulate mycorrhizal pop?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the earlier questions was talking about how do you, change the biology or something. One way to capture that, do that is, as you graze or forage on higher lignin forages, more mature grasses, obviously it's going to change the fungal to bacteria ratio within the rumen. That's a good way to help move fungal component throughout your landscape, through poor areas. Obviously, if you're trying to move mycorrhizal fungi, that's a lot larger spore. It's just through the grazing activities, keeping that plant, kind of actively growing, dispensing roots, allowing association with mycorrhizal, and allowing the mycorrhizal hypha to expand further, making another association with other plants. So basically creating a web with underneath the soil of the mycorrhizal hypha.
Thank you, Shane. All right. The next question comes from Adam. And Adam says, how many years of good management do you need to get the somewhat mature mesquite to start dying back? I would assume that the large, well-pruned mesquite trees don't die back.
You will be surprised. Some of the larger ones are actually dying. I cannot give you an exact timetable. My environment is very erratic. I mean, I could have 2 or 3 years where I make a lot of progress, where we have favorable growing conditions, and in those years, you can see mesquite almost, if it doesn't die, it will stop growing fairly quick. So that's you might not see it die back as quickly, but you'll start seeing that it's not growing as vigorously as before. And then you also see that animal impact might start pruning some of the lower branches and promote more of a tree regrowth instead of a brush. So those will be the first signs of making a change. Eventually, the soil biology will change, and then we'll start weakening some of those mesquites. But I see benefits 3 to 5 years, I would say. You'll start seeing significant changes.
Excellent. The next question is from Sandy, and Sandy says, in the Pacific Northwest, we are fencing our creeks to exclude cattle, thinking we are doing good things for salmon restoration. how can we manage better? The creeks are becoming more eroded and the banks aren't breaking down unless there is very strong flooding.
Yes, the riparian areas, I understand the concern of being hesitant in grazing them, and by all means, I'm not going to tell you to graze them or not graze them, but you definitely need a disturbance, and that will help you gentle those banks. I think the most common mistake that I see is that they seclude just the riparian area and don't give enough room to be able to work the banks properly. And if that's the case, I suggest maybe you move some of those permanent fences and play around with some polywire and make some areas where you have control access to your riparian areas where you can work those slopes in key strategic locations. And those locations would be areas where you want to start promoting the induced meandering effect of the river. So you can definitely be more proactive in how we manage those riparian areas. But that's the biggest mistake, is closing it off too close to the riparian area itself. So
It also is a function of time. There's nothing wrong with grazing riparian areas usually, but it's a function of time. You have to restrict the amount of time they have access to any given area and then allow adequate rest and recovery.
And that goes back to what we always refer to as historical ecological context, in that how were our streams and our rivers and all of that, many decades and even centuries ago, so much better than they are today, much more gently sloped, a lot more grassed in, those types of things. And we had excellent fisheries. Well, how did all of that happen? That happened because we had large herds of various types of wild ruminants that obviously were using, nobody else was fencing out riparian areas at that point in time. So these wild ruminants were obviously using these natural streams and rivers and watering sources as their watering source. And so Gabe is exactly correct. It's a function of time and the way that we're attacking them with our livestock. We have actually worked with Trout Unlimited in a number of upper Midwest states to use livestock as a tool to restore trout fisheries, and it has been quite successful. Luke?
Yeah, I was just going to add, those are all excellent points. And I look at this as the same as CRP on a lot of our production acres around here. We think of just pulling everything out of any kind of management, pulling everything out of having livestock or human interaction with it is the best way to go, but we actually see it go backwards. So planned, purposeful interactions with those areas will do great things. And following Fernando's methods here, I would assure you would probably lead you to great results.
Thanks. So the next question is from Kevin. And Kevin says, I heard you mention keeping living roots in the ground year round, but never heard you talk about cover crops. What is the ideal method to implement livestock impact and applying a cover crop during the start of building organic matter?
Well, there's definitely many methods of getting more biomass into your pastures. If you want to choose investing in seed and planting cover crops, I'm sure Luke here will jump in and give you a much better answer. But you would treat it the same as a new species just emerging and your natives, and you want to give it full time to establish, and really the point of the cover crop is to cover the soil. So you want to ensure that you get enough growth and establishment. Maybe let it go to seed before you come in and graze it. Luke, this is more your area of expertise.
No, I mean, I think we just have to understand the context here, and why Fernando wasn't really talking about cover crop seeds is it just doesn't fit his context of his whole system. We get asked this a lot about, interseeding cover crops into perennial pastures. And I guess it really just depends on what your overall goal is. What do you want that cover crop to do for you? A lot of times, if we would simply just alter our rest periods and change, probably understand that we are overstocked in the first place, rest and recovery is more of a friend than try to interseed some of these diverse cover crop mixtures. And in my opinion, yeah, there's some times where we've had some success with warm season grasses, but if your pastures are lacking warm season species, why not change your grazing habits to where you can start to encourage more perennial warm season species to come in? So it all depends on what you want, and you manage your grazing for what you want to express itself.
If I may, I really think it's important to step in and say here, oftentimes people get confused and they think that they need to be seeding annual cover crops into a perennial pasture. There is no better cover crop than a diverse mix of perennials, plain and simple. It's very rarely that we seed covers into perennial pastures. Okay, proper adaptive grazing stewardship, and I love that, Fernando, is the way to stimulate diversity in perennial pastures, not interseeding annuals into perennials.
Thank you, Gabe. So the next question and comments are this. Hi, Fernando. Well done and thanks. Just a quick point of clarification for me. I understand one of the soil health principles is to not disturb soil. However, I often hear of the benefits of dung beetles as they burrow into the soil. Livestock is the impact as they impact soil through hoof action and other disturbances, etc. My question is, what is the difference? When we are saying not disturbing the soil, are we really saying don't till or rip? I need clarification.
Yes, you're right. We mean more in tillage and subsoiling and exposing the underlayers of the soil to the elements. When we work the soil through animal impact, it's more of a gentle massage rather than ripping through the soil profile. So I guess the clarification is avoid disturbing the soil profile at a deeper level. That just brings more oxygen and you'll burn your organic matter more quickly. You might see a quick benefit, but as deep as you work that land, it's going to be as deep as you're going to compact it the next year. So avoid those deep disturbances.
And I would add to that as well, there are natural disturbances, and we also a lot of times call these disruptions, and there are unnatural disturbances. So unnatural disturbances would be chemicals, synthetic fertilizers, tillage, ripping of the soil, overgrazing. All of those types of things can, create a negative compounding effect, whereas things like dung beetles, which are obviously a very natural disturbance and it's been happening for millennia, the livestock themselves disturbing the soil under high density through their hoof action, all of that is very natural and everything responds to that. So the soil microbes respond to those types of disturbances in a very favorable way. The plants and the roots of the plants respond to those types of disturbances in a very good way. But when we have those unnatural disturbances, that's when we have an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next is from Nick, and it says, Fernando, how long of a rest period do you have to have before the same animals would return to the same piece of land? What would you do if you have paddocks or areas that do not have water for your animals?
Well, you have to work within your context. Pastures that I'm limited by water, I might only be able to use in certain seasons. And if that's the case, then you want to make sure that you at least make pasture deferrals in those areas, and you just skip them entirely for a whole year if you're repeatedly hitting those areas due to lack of water distribution. The proper recovery period, well, I wish I could tell you. It's moisture dependent. It depends on your grass species. What I see most people making the greatest progress in the arid West, it's once you start falling into at least the occasional year and a half of recovery periods, that allows enough time for new grass species to establish, just because of the low precipitation. On more humid environments, well, that's going to vary, but again, you have to be okay in those humid climates to see your grasses go old. Because if you want to improve diversity, well, you're not going to achieve that by always focusing on maintaining that high palatability in what you already have. So it's very context dependent. Manage for what you want.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, the length of a rest period is dependent on a whole host of things. And like you said, Fernando, that equates to context. You know, if you're in the type of environment that Fernando is in, then, you know, you are going to inherently have longer rest periods. If you're in my environment, you know, in the hot, humid, deep South, you know, we're not going to have nearly the length of rest period that Fernando would have. And if we did, we would end up with a lot of old oxidized grass, like in one of the pictures that Fernando showed. So you have to weigh out, you know, a number of things here, and you also have to be highly observant. You want to rest long enough to have adequate rest and recovery, and to increase levels of diversity. But again, you don't want to rest so long that you oxidize the grass in that area. Anything else, Fernando?
Yeah, my best advice is just grab up one pasture, don't do it all throughout your landscape, and give it a different treatment. That's why it's called adaptive, and see what the response you get. You might be surprised.
So the next question is from our own Burke Tykert, and Burke says, Fernando, are you using some herding to simulate smaller paddocks in some of your large pastures?
I do. On my larger pastures, I rely heavily on my natural herd instinct. So I always, there's couple components you need to have for that herd instinct to really kick in. You need to have no stress. So handling stress must be eliminated. If you're trying to force your cattle into a situation, more than likely you're not going to succeed. Second, that stress can come in many factors, and one is the nutritional requirements of your animals. So if you don't have the quality of grass, they're not going to be wanting to behave as a herd if they're competing for survival. So you might have to play around on which times of the year you want to work with this. Usually the best time is at the end of the growing season, and when there's plenty of forage, and it will be easier to get what you want on that herding instinct. Another one is your water situation. So we know that in ultra high grazing environments, we want cattle to travel to water as individuals to lower the burden of your water systems. But that becomes inherently stressful when you're trying to promote the herding instinct, because we want everyone to travel together at the entire time. So if you don't have adequate water, you're not going to get there. So another one is environmental stress factors. One was feed quality, and if it's really hot and they're going to be seeking out shade, so you got to meet their environmental requirements as well. If you play with all of those factors, how I typically do it is in the evenings. In the mornings, I graze towards water. In the evenings, I graze towards pasture. where I want them to graze or bed down. And it's more of a suggestion rather than a forceful act. At first, it might not be very effective, but later on, the real trick to herding and stockmanship is to make it think it was their idea. Yeah.
Thanks, Fernando. And the next question is from Charis, and if I pronounced your name wrong, forgive me. But the question is, first, thank you for the great presentation since I'm new to regenerative approaches. I understand that it would take years to create this diversity on soil, but just curious, how long does it take for a soil to recover from its worst to its best? Is 5 years a short time or a long time for this to occur? From transitioning from a conventional way of farming to regenerative?
Very context dependent. I can tell you in optimal growing conditions, yeah, in 3 to 5 years, you can have significant impacts in a burial environment. In a more controlled environment, like that irrigation pivot, in one season, I did what it would have taken me 5 years in my natural setting. Why? Because I could make it rain with a push of a button. But I mean, that comes to show if the more productive your environment, the quicker the response, the less predictable your rainfall. Well, it might take a couple of years of advancement and a couple of stepping back and so forth.
Luke?
Yeah, I would just also add to this. So, like Fernando said, it is context driven, but also understand when you say transitioning from worst to best, understand you're probably never going to see its best. It's going to be better, but it's never going to be best. We're always dealing with a degraded resource. So my recommendation for folks is just be more observant, hold to the 6-3-4 as tightly as you can, and you'll see faster progress than you can ever imagine. But you also have to look for things. You can't look for the negatives, look for the positives and find those small little wins. Be really observant and always look, put the shovel in the soil, make observations. And I think you'll see more things improving in the right direction at a faster pace than you realize. Regenerative ag moves at an exponential pace once you hold true to the 6-3-4. It might take a few years at a crawl, but the golden ratio rule, the 1, 1, 3, 5, 8, 13, 22, that kind of theory comes into play where you start to explode and things progress. But just enjoy it. There's no destination in this, and remember that.
That is right, Luke. In nature, 1 + 1 does not equal 2.
Absolutely. The next question is from Mark, and Mark asks, talk about the length of your graze periods and rest periods.
Okay, so I think the grace period and the recovery period, they're both equally important. But the grazing period, it's more important when you have active growth. So if you have active growth, you want to shorten the duration of your grazing period. How short is too short? Well, it depends on your context and on the grazing efficiency that you want to achieve. For example, in a highly productive pasture, it pays to do ultra high intensive grazing because I can achieve 80 or 90% grazing efficiency. And in that scenario, you might doing daily or multiple changes a day. In a more burial environment and where you have larger pastures, you might not, you should not stay long enough there to graze that pasture in its entirety if you're in the active growing season. So you have to keep moving, otherwise you're going to regraze the same plant twice. So if you have very large pastures, there's going to have to be a point where you say, okay, time to move on. And I'm happy with 3 to 5, even up to 10-day periods of stay if it's really large pasture. But I note that the past a few days during optimal growing conditions, you're already regrazing those plants. So be observant. The moment you start seeing that, time to move on.
Okay, a couple more here. So from Donald says that irrigated pasture appears to have some other species like clover. So it looks like you're getting diversity from the beginning. Can you speculate how long it takes to get the diversity you want from a field?
I mean, in that particular scenario, it's that it was continuously grazed, and you had to also know that how you graze a pasture will drive the species that will thrive in it. So your clovers and your sod-forming grasses are more tolerant for severe grazing. And the moment you allow that recovery, that's the reason why clovers exploded. And you'll see that quite frequently on horse pastures and areas where they are severely grazed, because that's the only species that can tolerate it. Now, as you progress into longer recovery periods, you allow bunch grasses to establish, and then you'll see more diversity kick in. I cannot tell you an exact time of how long it will take for those species. You might already have the seed there in the soil. For example, in that picture of the clovers, on the field behind it, the previous year to try to grow a cover crop mix that didn't germinate. But as soon as I did a high density grazing and long recovery, it started germinating. So somebody else put the seed for me, but the conditions were not there for those plants to establish. So we have to focus on that soil armor, that disturbance and that recovery period, so that we allow for whatever we have there to manifest itself. And it might take a couple years.
And I would just add to that, first of all, don't limit in your mind how much diversity you can have. And don't think that once I get to, 24 species, 36 species, well, great, we're done. My experience has been that diversity is sort of the gift that keeps giving. As you continue to implement adaptive grazing and the rule of disruption, year after year, you continue to stimulate additional diversity. And the other thing that we have found out is that as you build deeper and deeper soil aggregation, then year over year, you uncover and expose more and more diversity in plant species that can grow there. So I would strongly advocate that don't feel like there's a limit here, and just allow diversity to keep occurring year over year. And then the last question, how many cattle are needed in an acre of land for diversity to occur?
All right, so we refer to that to what grazing density do you require to generate a positive disruption. Again, it's very context dependent. Even just doubling the amount of stocking density that you already have can generate significant improvements. I would tell you that in some situations that might not be enough. In very compacted soils, you actually have to significantly increase that stock density before you start seeing a change. So again, context dependent, but I'd see that at least about 150 head per acre, you'll start seeing good results. You can get by with much less in some instances. So work with the density that is most practical for you to start with, and go from there.
I would agree. It's all about pounds per acre, stock density per acre, and not necessarily the number of head per acre. That's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck here. So again, I want to thank everybody for your attendance this evening, and thank you, Fernando, for an outstanding webinar. Boy, those pictures were just amazing. And again, as a reminder, we do have 2 upcoming webinars on March 7 and March 14. So mark them down on your calendar, and we look forward to seeing everybody again at that time. Good night.
Great job, Fernando.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Good job, Fernando.